If the Christian Church at the end of the Middle Ages did not already have its hands full dealing with heretics and dissenting movements, it also had to contend with serious disorder in its own central precincts. The situation in the Eternal City, Holy Rome, had become so dire, even the popes elected to abandon their palace. The time of troubles only deepened when at length a second pope was elected in direct challenge to the sitting pope. With two pontiffs jostling for the throne of St. Peter, the Church entered an absolutely unprecedented time of turmoil. The situation was exacerbated 31 years into this apparently unsolvable conflict when a church council elected another pope aimed at replacing the two feuding ones. Alas, the two reigning popes declined to retire, and the matter was worse now than ever, with three men denouncing the others and claiming to be the one vicar of Christ on earth. Theologians and church lawyers studied the situation long and hard, but before closure was reached on the matter, 4 decades had passed, and the authority of the Church greatly weakened by conflict and the papal schism.
An event on the 7th day of September in the year 1303 marks a turning point in the history of the papacy. In fact, it's a turning point in the history of Western Christendom, and I would go so far as to say a turning point in the history of European civilization altogether. Because on that day, in September 1303, armed men forced their way into the papal residence in the town of Anagni, where Pope Boniface VIII was staying. They insulted him. They threatened to kill him. They tried to force him to abdicate the papal throne, to resign as pope, and generally abused him. This was essentially unprecedented behavior, and it's known as the outrage at Anagni. It indicated crisis for the papacy. Between 1305 and 1378, 7 popes succeeded one another on the throne of St. Peter as pope, and they lived more or less continuously in the town of Avignon. Avignon today is in France. It was not in France in the 14th century. It was just outside the French border. But how came this to be that the papacy has abandoned Rome and gone effectively to France? Dante wrote, and I quote, "Ah, Italy, abode of sorrow." He's commenting on the situation. It gives us a clue to what's happening which precipitates the shift of the papacy north. Abode of sorrow, vessel without a helmsman, amidst a dreadful storm. No longer art thou mistress of these peoples, but a place of prostitution. Now, these people who in thy dominions wage implacable war amongst themselves, those protected by the same wall and the same ramparts, rend each other. Search, unhappy country, and see around thy shores if in thy bosom a single one of thy provinces enjoys peace. We have a picture of civil strife. It isn't an isolated opinion. Let us hear the words of Petrarch, an Italian poet who went to Rome in the year 1350, and he filed this report. Speaking of Rome, the eternal city, he said, "The houses fall down, the walls collapse, the temples are overthrown, shrines are wrecked, and laws trodden underfoot. The Lateran Palace, where the popes were at the time, is razed to the ground, and its basilica, mother of all churches, stands roofless, open to the wind and rain and elements." Now, never believe figures. When you read historical sources, take them with a grain of salt. But some sources say that the population of Rome during the 14th century crisis shrank from 1 million to 20,000. Well, even if the figures are grossly inflated, it is indicative of crisis and conflict in Rome. As early as 1314, Dante wrote a letter to the Italian cardinals, which opened with these words. And he said, "How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is the mistress of the Gentiles become a widow?" Rome was in deep difficulty by the 14th century. No Holy Roman Emperor since Otto III had actually reigned there. Otto had been gone for 300 years. No emperor in 300 years actually lived in Rome. The loss of the papacy, the loss of the economic aspects of the papacy were absolutely appalling and overwhelming. Floods, fires, famines, earthquakes, a whole battery of natural disasters had really caused Rome to take that steep decline downhill as a city. There were endless struggles between the barons and the baronial families in Rome and in the general area. Now, these were powerful clans, and they occupied forts and fortresses and barricades and carried on their internecine struggle. Beyond this, robbery, murder, extortion were commonplace. The city is almost literally writhing in agony. It had no rulers. People fought constantly with each other everywhere. Robbers lurked behind practically every rock and bush of Rome, waiting to pounce upon unsuspecting passers-by. Nuns were insulted. There was no refuge. Young girls were accosted and led away to dishonor publicly in the streets of Holy Rome. Wives taken from their husbands, sometimes from their very beds. Farmhands going to work were robbed in the gates of the city. Christian pilgrims coming would be met not by church people, but by thugs who would beat them, rob them, kill them, and otherwise abuse them. There was no protection. Even the priests were criminals. According to one account, everywhere there was lust. Everywhere there was evil. Nowhere was there justice. There was no law at all. Now, there were strong men who rose up from time to time and seized power and tried to exercise some order and authority. One example would be Cola di Rienzo, who actually ruled twice for short periods of time, but alas, he too wound up dead, murdered. So the question is this: having painted this very bleak background, I ask you what will now appear to be an obvious question. Why did the papacy move out of Rome? And why did the papacy stay away from Rome all of these years? Well, there's several reasons, of course. First is the unsettled state in Italy, which I have just described to you briefly. Secondly, there was a need to end the problems associated with the rash declarations of Pope Boniface VIII. For example, he forbade any taxation at all upon church income. Well, for heaven's sake, church income would take up most of the economy in Italy at this time. Another reason they moved away was trying to attempt a reconciliation between England and France, who were at war and who were at war for over a century. Another reason would be the preponderance of French cardinals. The 7 popes who ruled in Avignon created 134 cardinals. 112 of them were French. Of the people who worked at the papal court, whose national identity we can identify, 70% of them were French. Of the 96 of the 112 cardinals created by the Avignon popes, they not only were French, but they all came from Languedoc, one particular region in southern France. Another reason was the palace of the popes itself, which you can see to this day in Avignon. It's being preserved to a very fine degree. It was a work of art. It was also a fortress, and it was just a good place to be in such troubled times. And eventually the popes bought the entire city of Avignon in 1348. Why not stay? And finally, one of the reasons they didn't go away from Avignon too soon is because the French kings wanted to control ecclesiastical affairs. And how much easier to do so when Avignon is just across the river from French territory and Rome is so far south in another state altogether. Now it's Pope Clement V, who ruled from 1305 to 1314, who surrendered power to the French kings. It was he who agreed to absolve that gang of thugs that had abused Pope Boniface VIII. It was he, Clement V, who created cardinals of the friends of Philip the Fair, the French king. You see, we've got some politicking going on here. It was Clement who agreed to the posthumous trial of the Templars, who were brutally suppressed. It was he who gave hostages to Philip. A lot of issues come to the fore in the pontificate of Clement V, but perhaps the most important of the popes at Avignon was not Clement, but John the 22nd, who ruled from 1316 to his death in 1334. He bestowed bishoprics himself and did away with elections by cathedral chapters. We've talked about the monarchical power of the popes. Well, John is just another in a long line of this. The rights of nomination were given over to the papacy. He excluded heads of state. He excluded other legitimate authorities from their rightful role in such matters. It's no surprise that he condemned the theory of the lay state, as outlined by Marsilio of Padua in his book, The Defensor Pacis, of which we will hear more of in this particular session. And he utilized the Inquisition to some effect. But he also, because of his, shall we say, abusive use of power, gained some powerful enemies. The Emperor Louis IV appointed an alternative pope by the name of Nicholas V, and in 1328 at Rome declared John deposed from the papacy on grounds of heresy, and actually had him burnt in effigy in pontifical robes, a very powerful symbolic symbol to burn the Pope's effigy publicly. Now, the Avignon popes focused on persecuting heretics, and the measures against the heretics bore fruit. The stake reduced the dissenters to silence, for the Inquisition pursued them relentlessly. I'm speaking now of Cathars and Waldensians and other types of heretics who inhabited what is today southern France. The bark of Peter, it's a reference to the church, is in danger of sinking, one writer put it, and the fisherman's net of breaking. Instead of peace and calm, storm clouds are piling up. Disastrous wars are laying waste the lands of the Roman Church and the neighboring regions. The sower of tares is loosening his sharpest darts against them. These words were words used by cardinals at Perugia who were summarizing the situation in Italy at the beginning of the 14th century. What I'm trying to say is that from every source available, we have a picture of turmoil, of chaos, of conflict, of the papacy being in deep, dark danger. The Defensor Pacis, it's a Latin term meaning the defender of the peace. I'll say something about it later. That particular influential book accused the papacy of being a fiction and being the cause of the conflict in the land. Yes, there's conflict, and guess who caused it? You did. The popes have done it through their abuses and their behavior. The whole period is marked by numerous wars and the continual, protracted struggle between the state and the church. Even personalities within the late medieval church spoke out in strident terms. Birgitta of Sweden wrote of the church, wrote of her own church. Here's a woman who gave her entire life to the church of the Middle Ages. She's not an enemy, she's a friend, yet listen to what she says. Avignon is a brothel. The cloisters have changed into whorehouses. The 10 Commandments have, in the hands of the priest, been summarized into only one statement: give me your money. Now this is a friendly voice. This isn't an enemy. Indeed, Catherine of Siena, whose name we've also heard previously, called the papal legates incarnate demons. Evil pastors, she wrote, who poison and putrefy this garden. Now, when you're reading this kind of language, it's important to know who wrote it. If this were coming from a heretic, a dissenter, somebody who'd been kicked out, you can say, look, they've got an axe to grind. But when these words and critiques are coming from inside, by women in this case, who have devoted their entire lives to the church, it puts a different perspective on matters. We probably should take it seriously because they have less to gain from criticizing the church. Well, indeed, if we follow Birgitta and Catherine, there were excesses and there were corruptions at Avignon. The papal court exceeded all of the others in Europe in terms of extravagance. Now, let me share with you part of the menu. As an example, a list of provisions for dinner. On the 22nd of November, 1324, to celebrate the marriage of Pope John the 22nd's great niece. I mean, hardly even a close relative, a great niece. We're going to throw a party here at the Papal Palace in Avignon, and on that occasion, the dinner menu included 4,012 loaves of bread, 690 chickens, 8 3/4 oxen, 580 partridges, I don't know who counted these things, 55 sheep, 270 rabbits, 12 pigs, 383 birds, 3,000 eggs, 2,000 apples and pears, and 11 barrels of wine. We're going to have a bit of a party here. Now, I've abbreviated the list. It went on at some length. Extravagance. This is supposed to be the See of Peter, the center of the church, and we're just going to throw big parties. Indeed, there were 18 different kinds of taxes, paid either directly or indirectly to the curia. I speak of the papal court. And in the course of the 14th century, the papacy became rooted in the interests of the French. I've mentioned that the majority of cardinals were French. They could be relied upon to elect French pontiffs, who could be relied upon to appoint French cardinals, who could be relied upon to elect more French popes, who would create more French cardinals. You see the picture? We have a French Revolution long before the real French Revolution, just going around and around. The papal institution is French. This is going to cause some problems because most of the world isn't French, even in the 14th century. So what to do? In 1377, Pope Gregory XI was persuaded to bring the papacy home. Bring the Pope back to Rome. Now, his cardinals opposed him. No, no, no. They were French. They did not want to leave the lovely banks of the Rhone River and go back to strife-stricken central Italy. And the barons in Rome, these are the nobles, when they heard that Gregory was coming back, they said, don't come. If you do, we're going to kill you. Whoa, he's between a rock and a hard place, but he did have the courage to come back. He withstood them all, but the situation was so bad, so dire in Rome, that no sooner had he got there when he determined he was going back to Avignon. Alas, before he could do much of anything, he inconveniently died. Now, as long as the policy, the aims, and the interests of the popes and the cardinals were identical, there really wasn't any problem. But once differences began to emerge, trouble soon came, and trouble is going to burst like a thunderstorm in 1378. And this is going to be the turning point in the late medieval papacy. When Gregory XI died in 1378, the misfortunes of the Church, which I have highlighted here very briefly for you, were exacerbated and they took a steep downturn. He intended to return the papacy to Rome. His death, of course, precipitated the first papal election in Rome since 1303, 75 years since a conclave had been held. The conclave was a fiasco. That's putting it rather nicely. Gangs of thugs roamed the streets of Holy Rome and congregated outside the Vatican Palace where the election conclave was gathered. And in one voice, they demanded the election of an Italian pope. Remember, the 7 previous popes have been French. The chronicler Froissart records the mob shouting, "Give us a Roman pope, otherwise we will make your heads redder than your hats." Cardinals always wore red hats. The conclave was comprised of 16 cardinals. 10 of them were French, 4 of them Italian, Robert of Geneva, and the Spaniard Pedro de Luna. Now, the conclave, once assembled, could not disband until a decision was made. When the sitting pope dies, and he will die one of these days, the College of Cardinals in Rome will go into conclave. What that means is they'll be locked up until they make a decision on who the next pope is. That's what a conclave is. The idea dates back to 1271, when after 3 years of indecision, the cardinals couldn't decide on who should be the next pope. They were locked up in a room with strict orders not to come out until they had elected someone. Now, a conclave can be an excellent tool of manipulation. In the early 13th century, the Roman bandit Matteo Orsini had the cardinals locked up in a small ruined temple without food and without water. His men were instructed to climb up on the roof of the said temple, which was full of holes, and to urinate and defecate upon their holy eminences below until such time as the cardinals saw fit to elect his candidate. And they didn't take that long coming to an acceptable decision. A servant of Cardinal de Luna records the events of this conclave in Rome. 1 hour after we were shut up, he says, there arose from outside the building such an uproar from the mob, which grew until the cardinals could hardly make themselves heard one to the other. The mob forced its way into the palace. The cardinals were upstairs. This mob has come in downstairs, and they tried to shove their lances through the ceiling. But hopefully no one is sitting on the floor upstairs. So here you can imagine this. They're trying to seek the will of God, if you will, as to who should be the next Holy Father. You've got a mob that is screaming outside the windows, thugs below who are stabbing their lances through the floor, all in the midst of this situation which went on through the night. Dawn broke over the eternal city with the unauthorized ringing of the great bell which signaled a call to arms. The Archbishop of Bari was hastily elected. We've got to do something. One cardinal went to the window and he called out, "Bari!" to give some indication to the crowd that the Archbishop of Bari had been elected, but alas, in the confusion, they thought he was saying the Frenchman Jean de Bar had been elected. And that was just about too much. Since the Archbishop of Bari was not present, they had to get his consent to be pope, and he wasn't there. The mob wasn't going to wait. Thinking another Frenchman, Jean de Bar, had been elected, the crowd stormed the Vatican. There arose an even more powerful howl from this demon-possessed mob, as the chronicler puts it, "We want a Roman." Chanting this, they broke into the chapel, swords drawn. The terrified cardinals, who thought that their end had come and they were all about to meet their maker, grabbed this elderly Roman cardinal, put him on the throne, put the papal gowns on him, and ran off. So the crowd thought that this old guy, this Roman, was actually the Pope, when in fact he was not. The frenzied mob began to engage in a wild display of pious toe-kissing, so we're told, despite the protests of the aged cardinal, who did his best to tell them, "I'm not the Pope. They just sat me here." And then this poor old guy seems to have lost it. He became hysterical. And instead of blessing the people who were bowing before him, he started ranting about demons, and then he began cursing and swearing. The long night and the stress had just kind of got to this poor old guy. But by this time the cardinals had made good their escape, and the next day the Archbishop of Bari was confirmed as Pope Urban VI. The envoy at the papal court, a man by the name of Cristofero of Piacenza, who worked for the Duke of Mantua, filed a report about these particular events on the 9th day of April, 1378. I think it's important to hear these words as a context for what happens next. "Most magnificent my Lord, commending myself once more to you, I write to inform your sovereignty that, as I wrote earlier, the Lord Pope Gregory left this world on the 27th day of March, and that on the 8th day of April the Lord's Cardinal elected to the papacy the Lord Bartholomew, Archbishop of Bari, a man of Neapolitan descent, a person both learned in the law and well versed in the usages of the world, and one who will assuredly be advantageous to the Holy Church of God." Well, that sounds very positive. This sounds very reassuring, and if I were the Duke of Mantua, I would be so pleased to know that things finally have turned around. And then the envoy Cristofero sends a second letter. "I write to inform your lordship that since I wrote you last on the 9th day of the present month, saying that we had an Italian Pope, on the same day, at about the 22nd hour, the Lord Cardinals gave him a name, and he was proclaimed Urban VI. And I truly believe that we have a Pope to please you, and am convinced that the Church of God will be well governed. And I will even go so far as to say that for 100 years or more, the Holy Church of God has not had a pastor like him." Well, this was the high point of the assessment of Urban VI, because it would be all downhill from there. Urban created a highly volatile situation. He was violent, he was erratic, he became ever abusive, and it's possible that he was in fact absolutely deranged. This broadsheet shows a pope as a rich man sitting at a table in a state of chaos, and chaos was really the state of affairs at the papal court under the pontificate of Urban VI. The French cardinals were so upset by this that they withdrew in the spring to Anagni, publishing a declaration that the papal election had been illegal. It was invalid, and they invited Pope Urban VI to abdicate. They invited him to step down, to resign, to do the honorable thing. But Urban, it's good to be the Pope, he was going nowhere. He wasn't interested in resignation. He rather enjoyed being the vicar of Jesus. Well, with Rome and Italy significantly disrupted, Urban refusing to listen to any suggestion that his reign was undesirable, the cardinals elected Robert of Geneva as Pope, and he took the name Clement VII and was installed at Avignon, where the machinery of papal government was already set up and the papal schism was underway. The rock of Peter had split. We have in Christendom now two popes who've been legitimately elected, one in Rome, one in Avignon, both of them excommunicating each other, each of them insisting that they're the true Pope. And where is the unity of Christendom? Where is the integrity of the Church now? Catherine of Siena wrote to Urban in Rome, and she said, in my opinion, these incarnate demons have not elected Christ on earth, she's speaking of Robert of Geneva, but have brought into being an antichrist against you who are Christ on earth. The reverberations throughout Europe were absolutely profound. John of Spoleto wrote a letter in 1394. He was a law professor at Bologna. He said, the longer this schism lasts, and I've jumped ahead in time here about 16 years, so it's been going on 16 years. John of Spoleto says, the longer this schism lasts, the more it appears to be costing, and the more harm it does. Scandals, massacres, ruination, agitations, troubles, and disturbances. This dissension is at the root of everything. Divers tumults, quarrels between kings, seditions, extortions, assassinations, acts of violence, wars, tyranny, decreasing freedom, the impunity of villains, grudges, errors, disgrace, the madness of steel and fire given license. Wow, this is a really red-hot letter. He's saying the whole papal schism is at the root of the whole issue, and something has got to be done about it. But down in Rome, Pope Urban's attitude was simply this: I'm the Pope, I can do anything I want. You don't like it? You can go somewhere else, because I'm the Pope. He was not going to be persuaded. He had his enemies arrested, together with anybody he considered disloyal or who might be disloyal. We're talking about a real purge here. Among this group of people arrested were 6 cardinals. We have a witness. The German Dietrich of Nîmes tells us that Urban would walk in his garden, calmly reading his Breviary, that's his devotional book, while the elderly Cardinal of Venice was being tortured in a nearby room on the Strappado. And the Cardinal would scream out in agony, Holy Father, Christ suffered for our sins. The Strappado is a torture device whereby you hoist somebody up by their hands tied behind their backs to the ceiling, you attach weight to their feet, and then on the pulley you drop them. They don't hit the floor. The rope is long enough so that they stop before they hit the floor, and the weight attached to their feet pulls all of their joints out of joint. That's the first time. Then you hoist them back out, up, and drop them again. I am told on the second drop, the pain is exquisite. Picture this, an elderly cardinal being tortured this way, and the Pope walking in the garden, calmly saying his prayers, listening to the screams, but paying no heed. Now this is the kind of Pope who's sitting in Rome at this time. 5 of those 6 cardinals I mentioned disappeared, never heard from again. I wonder what happened to them. Cardinal Pedro de Luna, in April 1378, said if the Pope thought anybody had any doubts about his legitimate reign, they wouldn't escape. Now remember the letters that I read to you in part from Cristofero. I think he's been gravely mistaken in his assessment of Urban. What in the world are we going to do now? Well, there's a Latin poem of the 15th century that summarizes the prevalent attitude about the disintegration of Western Christendom, which is literally happening right before the eyes of observers. Now listen to this poem in part. It says to the Pope, once the wonder of the world has fallen. Now is the time of Simon Magus. Golden was the first age of the papal court. Then came the baser age of silver. Next the Iron Age, long set its yoke upon the stubborn neck. Then came the age of clay. Could anything be worse? Yes, excrement. And in excrement sits the papal court. Oh, it's a pretty sad picture. That's part of a poem. I mean, we are seeing the disintegration, the collapse of the central institution of the Middle Ages. Upon this rock I will build my church, said Jesus Christ, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well, I'll tell you what, by the late 14th century, it appears that the gates of hell are very much prevailing against the Church of God on the rock. What are we going to do now? Well, I can assure you that there were men and women in Europe who were very unhappy. There was corruption in the church. I will not shield you from that, but it would be erroneous to say that, well, the whole church was corrupt, and all of the popes and the bishops and the cardinals were just dirty, rotten scoundrels who were irredeemably wicked. No, that would be wrong. There were men and women who said, we've got to do something. We have got to reform the church. Well, as a result of this horrible schism, the church took steps towards reform. A call was issued for reform in head and in members. The result was what we call conciliarism. Due to the papal schism, fundamental questions were being raised. For example, was the church to be identified with the entire body of the faithful, all Christians? Or was the church to be identified with the Pope and the papal court? Or, if the papacy was vacant, could the cardinals convene a council which might be authoritative? Now, I can tell you that had the principles of the conciliar movement succeeded, the Christian church would have become a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy. But now I've already revealed the end of the story. Conciliarism did not succeed, but it's important that we understand this movement. So let me turn our attention to that for the next few moments. Conciliarism was based on canonist thought, canon law, which in turn was founded upon a movement to reform the church. So, conciliarism should be regarded as an effort to reform the church from within. These people didn't want to leave the church and reform it. They wanted to stay within the church and reform from that position. Now, along with the canonists, canon lawyers, the influence of two men, very important. I have mentioned them previously, Marsilio of Padua and William of Ockham. They're both important for understanding this particular movement. First, Marsilio. He lived between about 1275 and 1342. Padua, of course, being a city, an important university city in Italy. He's a political philosopher, and I already mentioned that he wrote this book in 1324 called Defensor Pacis, Defender of the Peace. The book was anti-papal. Marsilio argued that the unifying social factor is not the church at all. Instead, it's the state. People should create law, he said, rather than have it created for them, and people may oust bad leaders. Whether they be churchly or secular is not the point. Papal claims are effectively invalid, he argued. The church does have spiritual power, yes, but it has no political or legal power. And he argued that councils are supreme in the church. Now, there's much more to be said about Marsilio, but if you can understand some of those basic principles, you will see how it could fuel into a movement to reduce papal power and shift authority to councils, which is what conciliarism was all about. The other man is William of Ockham. He lived between about 1280 and about 1349. He was an English Franciscan, and I have previously mentioned that he was an influence upon the thought of John Wycliffe. He criticized Aristotelian thought and theory, and like Marsilio, He defended imperial theory over against its papal counterpart. In plain English, both of these men thought that the church should not be exercising secular authority. That should be left to the civil governments. So, with some of these thoughts and ideas in mind, in 1409, more than 30 years after the papal schism began, an ecumenical council was convened in the city of Pisa to try and end the schism. This council came together for one principal purpose: to put an end to the embarrassing and factious uproar in the papal courts. And I emphasize plural because we've got two of them. So here's what they did. They said the only way to get to the bottom of this is to get rid of these two guys. These two popes that are incorrigible, so that you're fired. And so are you. The Council of Pisa ruled. They fired both of them. On the 5th of June, 1409, seeing that the church was hopelessly stalled, the council declared, having invoked the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, this holy council defines, declares, and decrees both sitting popes to be notorious schismatics and heretics, and you're fired. And what they did is they elected another man, Alexander V, to be the new pope. He was designed to be the only pope to replace this terrible 30-year-old schism. But the fathers of the Pisan Council seem to have overlooked one crucial piece of information. The two other popes, the one in Avignon, the one in Rome, they said, we're not going anywhere. We're not resigning. We're not being deposed. We've been legally elected. I'm the Holy Father. No, I'm the Holy Father, said the other one. And Alexander stood up and said, no, I'm the Holy Father. What we've got now is not two popes, but three popes. One in Avignon, one in Pisa, one in Rome, and the mess is worse than the beginning. When Alexander V died, this is the Pisan Pope, less than a year later, they elected John the 23rd. This is not the John of the 23rd from the 1960s, because this John the 23rd would go down in history as an anti-pope. But John the 23rd was elected. Now, they could have not elected a new guy in Pisa. Then you'd go back to two popes. No, they elect a new guy in Pisa. Three popes persist. He was elected, and the situation becomes exacerbated. Now, looking at this map, you will see that John the 23rd was supported by France and Italy, England, Scandinavia, and much of the empire. Benedict the 13th was supported by Spain and Scotland, and Gregory the 12th really only had isolated support from places like Rimini in Italy and Heidelberg in Germany. I don't know that I really have to press the point much further. The late medieval church was truly in a serious, bona fide mess. This particular broadsheet depicts the ship of Popery setting sail on its last voyage. You'll notice the two priests and two nuns, one holding a child and a bundle of papal missives in an apron, waving goodbye as the ship pulls out. The ship is fashioned from the traditional hellish monster's jaws, while the monster's 6 legs hold up the church. The spire of the church forms the mast. The progress of the ship is aided, if you'll notice in the top left-hand corner, by airborne devils who blow into the sails of the ship through a trumpet, bellows, and a fan, while others pull the ship along with ropes tied to the mast. I mean, we've got a pathetic ship that won't move on its own. You've got to have demons to get it going. There's a full team of monks and priests who have oars in their hands. The Pope, cardinals, and bishops are standing on the quarterdeck. This is, by all accounts, a rather ignominious voyage. And it's actually a wonderful visual depiction of the awful state that the Church of Jesus Christ has gotten itself into. Well, let's stay with conciliarism for a moment. There are still people, despite the three popes, they are determined to solve this problem. Good, pious men and women seeking truth, seeking reform. The most succinct and concise definition of the conciliar theory was set forth in the 5th session of the Council of Constance on April 6, 1415, and it's known by its Latin title, Haec Sancta, which is simply the first two Latin words of the decree. I'm going to read part of that. This Holy Synod of Constance first declares that it is legitimately assembled in the Holy Spirit. It constitutes a general council representing the Catholic or the universal church. It has power immediately from Christ. Listen to these words. This council says we have power directly from Christ, and everybody of whatever status or dignity, even the Pope, is bound to obey this council in those matters which pertain to the faith, the extirpation of the said schism, and the reformation of the church in head and in members. Again, Haec Sancta went on to say, it is declared that any one of whatever status or condition, even the Pope, who contumaciously, there's that word again, who stubbornly, that's the synonym, who stubbornly condemns the statutes, ordinances, or precepts of this sacred synod, or any other general council legitimately assembled, unless that person repents, shall be subject to appropriate penance and shall be duly punished, if need be, by recourse to other arms of the law. Now, I don't know how that strikes you, but let me tell you what the scholarly opinions on Haec Sancta are. On one hand, it has been called the most revolutionary official document in the history of the world. Now, I know that just hits you on the side of the head, so I'll say it again. It's been called the most revolutionary official document in the history of the world. That's one opinion. And the polar view is that it's conciliarism in its most extreme forms. May I humbly suggest that the truth and the best assessment probably lies somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. But my point is, this was an important document, and whether you loved it or hated it, you couldn't ignore it. Now, when I speak of conciliarism, let me mention the names just briefly in passing of three leading conciliarists. The first one, Pierre d'Ailly, who lived between 1350 and 1420, a French cardinal. He was called the hammer against the heretics, and he was influenced by William of Ockham. So that'll give you an idea of where Pierre d'Ailly is coming from. Our second leading conciliarist is another Frenchman by the name of Jean Gerson. 1363 to 1429 are his dates. He was the chancellor of the University of Paris. Gerson was convinced that a pope cannot dissolve the decisions of a council. Well, I mean, that's conciliarism right there. The council has more authority than a pope. A group of people have more authority than a single individual. And he said, Gerson, that a council may limit or modify papal authority. Our third conciliarist is the Italian Francesco Zabarella, 1360 to 1417, an Italian cardinal and a canon lawyer. And just one point from the works of Zabarella, he taught that it was possible for a pope to be a heretic. It's possible. Now, if that possibility has any validity, it certainly does now when we've got three guys sitting on three separate papal thrones, all claiming to be the representative of Jesus Christ. Now, essentially, the plenitude of power promoted by the popes was explained by the conciliarists as invested not in the popes, not in the papacy, but rather in the whole body of the church, represented by the General Council. So there's no loss of authority and power. It's simply redirected from an individual in a specific office to the whole church represented by us, the General Council. Well, there were other views expressed on how to solve the problem. In the late 14th century, Master John of Moravia, a student in the theological faculty at Paris, attracted attention by preaching sermons and suggesting in his sermons that the best solution was to simply kill those feuding popes and let's just start all over again. Kind of an extreme view. And then there's a remedy advanced by an anonymous observer at the Council of Constance with respect to the same problem. And how do we solve it? And this is just a little bit of humor. I found it among the Acts of the Council of Constance, and it reads this way. Recipe for the stomach of St. Peter, and for his total healing given at the Council of Constance. Take 24 cardinals, 100 archbishops and prelates, the same number from each nation, and as many priests as you can possibly get. Take all these church people and immerse them in Rhine River water and keep submerged for 3 days. It will be good for the stomach of St. Peter and for the removing of all his afflictions. Just kill them all. This is the problem, and let's start over. Well, John of Moravia and the Anonymous are proposing drastic measures aimed at lifting the church from her depraved seat on the dunghill that Latin poem spoke of. Well, the Council of Constance was truly an international event, attracting people from all over Europe who came seeking to repair the breach in the Rock of Peter. And not until the Council of Constance was summoned in 1415 could that breach, now nearly 40 years in the making, in the reality, be healed. By then, both Urban and Clement were dead, as well as many of their successors in this dual papacy. Huss had been burned by this very council. Wycliffe ordered dug up. The political face of Europe was altered beyond all recognition. And the papacy had reached its abject nadir, the deepest, darkest place you could possibly sink to. In 1417, the council elected Martin V as the single Pope of Christendom. Now, despite some challenges, though these were minor in the end, the papal schism had now run its course and was over. Martin was able to unite Christendom. The conciliar movement is linked to 3 councils: Pisa, which met in 1409, Constance, which solved it, which met between 1414 and 1418, and the Council of Basel, which sat for 18 years, between 1431 and 1449. But guess what Martin did? Having been elected by a conciliar, theory-driven body, almost his first act of office was to disband the council and to pass a law saying you may not appeal to councils against a pope. It's not insignificant that he had this change of heart once he came to power. He was a supporter of conciliarism as long as he was a cardinal. Once he became pope, he reverted quite quickly to the notion that popes need not be subject to general councils or to anybody, for after all, it's good to be the pope and I represent God. And thank you very much. I'll tell you what to do when. Don't call me, I'll call you. This attitude, almost a cavalier attitude, is best summed up by Pope Pius II. He was the humanist Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. He was elected pope in 1458. He was like Martin. He supported conciliarism while he was Aeneas. When he became pope, he changed his mind. When someone reminded him of his conciliar past, he had a 4-word answer for them. Reject Aeneas. Accept Pius. Well, what to say in conclusion? The rock had been assaulted. And for a while, it looked as though the gates of hell just might prevail this time. But the church hung on and survived. Barely.